You are listening to the Nostalgia Podcast with myself, Brian Scarf, and my co-host and good friend, Sebastian Morello. Welcome to the Nostalgia Podcast again, Sebastian, after quite some time.
Yeah, well, we struggled because you were gallivanting around the Far East. Now, I think you mentioned to me earlier that we were planning on speaking about sacred healing, and about ancestral wisdom with regard to care for the body. And your own trip was profoundly connected with sort of seeking out experiences of healing that are not readily available in the West. I don't know that. I don't know if you want to talk about any of that, or we can just go on to the abstract stuff.
Sure. So, some listeners who know me personally may be aware that I have a slight nervous condition which has impacts my muscular skeletal health. So it's a sort of chronic condition that I've had for nearly 2 decades, and it's the kind of thing that modern medicine throws up its hands and kind of abdicates responsibility over. So I have for some time also been looking for an opportunity to try and improve the way that my body is functioning, and I took a long sabbatical, two months in Singapore, where I could enjoy the benefits of good warm weather, high quality food, a lovely, excellent access to nature. Perhaps it's perhaps the greenest city, maybe in the world. Actually, it's an exceptional experiment of dense urbanism and the most extraordinary botanical gardens throughout. Obviously surrounded by the sea as well. Very low levels of pollution. But being in Asia, there is a lot of what is called traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, which is an umbrella term for all sorts of interesting treatments. And I was able to pursue primarily forms of acupuncture and Reiki. Reiki is a kind of ancient Taoist energy healing practice, which was codified in the early 20th century. And in the West, there's a lot of charlatanry, but in the East, it's taken very seriously. And I think I was able to experience firsthand that it is a very real, but very strange form of healing. Um, acupuncture, I find acupuncture absolutely fascinating. Acupuncture is one of these things where scholars generally say it's a couple of thousand years old. Um, that the map of meridians, these points across the body, all over the body, which are linked to certain energetic centers, primarily in the subtle. In the West, we'd call it the subtle body, but in the East, it's called a sort of called chi, and there are a number of other terms for it. Um, and and these meridian points, so scholars say it's about 2,000 years ago, but this is kind of the kind of doubtful scholar who looks for reasons to bring anything that's got a semblance of antiquity to being as recent as possible, to disenchant it in exactly the way that they do with sort of the Bible and all sorts of other ancient texts. But the interesting thing is that there's a whole other school um, of scholars who believe it's much older. There's a body that's been dug up. I don't remember the details. It's something like one of these peat bog bodies, perfectly preserved human body where the they know that it's about 5,000 years old, and it's mysteriously got tattooed on the body the exact meridian points for the treatment of lower back pain. And because the body is in excellent condition, they can also see that this body actually suffered from the exact back pain conditions that a modern acupuncturist would use the meridians that are tattooed on the body for. So it's this absolutely fascinating indicator of an extremely archaic tradition surrounding these energy meridians, which would push. I mean, this means we're talking about a wisdom of body healing that goes back to being parallel with really ancient Egypt, not just ancient Egypt, but ancient Egypt.
I
But
mean, when you look into the concept of the body and the way that the body flourishes um, in uh, in Asian medicine systems, they're much closer to pre-Enlightenment Western conceptions. All of the stuff that you'll find in the Church Fathers and the medieval scholastics, and even in mystics like John of the Cross. John of the Cross talks about how a lot of the difficulties that people can have in meditation, in prayer, in concentrating on a particular mystery, on remaining attentive to the presence of God throughout the day, can be on account of humor imbalance within the body, which is obviously a conception of the body derived um, ancient Greece. But of course, ancient Greece is in dialogue at that time with ancient Egypt, with Assyria. There's a huge amount of civilizational cross-pollination going on in the ancient world. And of course, you have the Silk Road, where many different tinctures and herbal remedies and so on would have been traveling backwards and forwards, and physicians and doctors would have been discussing this stuff all of the time. And whilst there are certain things that we know today about anatomy and physiology that might not want us to give the exact account of humor balance and imbalance that the ancient Greeks might have given, nonetheless, I think if we're going to be honest, we have to recognize that in the 18th and 19th centuries, a particular metaphor arose about how to think about the human body and how it works, and when it malfunctions, to use a popular phrase, how to get it working again. And that metaphor is the mechanistic metaphor. And we still predominantly think about the body like that. And it's very interesting because whilst my own health history has certainly not been as complex as yours, just to give I think it might be helpful actually throughout this discussion on sacred healing if you and I offer some anecdotal sort of experience of this stuff. And at least the first thing that I would like to note is that since I was a child, since I was about 6 or 7 years old, I was diagnosed with quite serious asthma, and to the point that on a number of occasions I had asthma attacks. And this made me very susceptible to respiratory diseases. So I got swine flu when I was living in Italy, and I nearly completely suffocated because that caused me to get pneumonia at the same time. So my lungs filled up with fluid, and my lungs remain scarred as a consequence of having pneumonia. And respiration has been an ongoing problem since my early childhood. And it got to the point that by the time I was in my late 20s, I was getting a pretty serious chest infection about every 3 weeks, particularly through the autumn and the winter, which got to the point where I didn't even know how I was going to remain in employment because I just couldn't. I could barely work. It was so debilitating. And I was walking the dog one day, and somebody said to me, you know, you should. I don't know how I got talking to this. Maybe she heard me kind of hacking away or something, and coughing and struggling to breathe. But I explained I had asthma and I got chest infections, and she said, you should start consuming dried or processed elderberries. Now, my wife had mentioned this previously, um, and I didn't know better at the time, but I didn't take it very seriously when my wife said it. But since there was sort of a second person now saying this, I thought, interesting. So I ordered a lot of dried elderberries, and now I don't order them. I tend to go and pick them because there's a lot of elderwood near my house, and we pick a lot of them and then freeze them, and we then use them throughout the winter. But anyway, what this lady said to me when I was out walking my dog is she said, your problem probably isn't asthma. You've probably got, some kind of disposition to a difficult respiration system. Doesn't quite work as you'd like, fine. But the reason why you're getting these infections and you're constantly unwell with this, because I had told her that this was an ongoing problem. In this conversation, she said it's an immunity function issue. That's what you're dealing with. You need to get your immune system working properly, and you need to take dried elderberries. And I started taking dried elderberries 3 or 4 times a day. And within about 3 months, not only was I not getting any chest infections and not getting ill, but my wheezing and my breathing problems had all disappeared. And and I mean, since that time, I can count on one hand the number of times I've had to take an inhaler or anything like that. Just taking dried elderberries, which all of our ancestors knew through the winter. Get your elderberries, cook them up, make a syrup, do something with them, make sure you're taking them every day. That's what's going to keep you strong. That's what's going to keep the bugs away. All of our ancestors knew this. This is an ancestral remedy of a medicine that is freely available on the landscape. I can literally walk for 3 minutes from my front door, and there's just elderwood going all the way down the fields that I can just go and pick as much elderberry as I like during the season. And that is a medicine that's freely available. But after 20 something years of asking a doctor what on earth can be done about my asthma, all I was given was new kinds of steroids and new kinds of, all sorts of laboratory made toxins that I was supposed to take. And yet the solution was 2 fields away from my house, growing along the hedgerow, right? And that sent me on a big journey. I mean, I don't know very much about acupuncture and about Reiki, but it sent me on a big journey, particularly to look into herbalism. And I suddenly found that herbalism was a massive part of the European medical tradition up until only a couple of centuries ago. And that the church has this vast amount of writing on it. Among its, you think about Albert the Great, Hildegard von Bingen, who wrote the Physica, an entire work on how God's benignity in his healing properties is woven into the things of the world, the goods of the world.
Both of those being doctors of the church.
Yeah, both just saints and doctors of the church.
If anybody says, well, the doctors of the church, they teach the church theology, etc., etc., you have to realize that healing is a spiritual pursuit. It's not separate from the spiritual life. In fact, unless you understand that, none of this stuff will make sense. I mean, the interesting anecdotes we've got, my wife's got some Chinese heritage, and she has a friend who has the most appalling hay fever. A form of hay fever that's so bad that nothing helps, nothing at all. That the antihistamines, doctors once again have given up. But bizarrely, acupuncture, sticking needles in just the right spots, keeps the hay fever from completely dominating his life. Gives him the ability to function normally through certain points of the year.
I know people who have been treated for hay fever through acupuncture. I've heard that.
My own experience with acupuncture is very interesting, because I was treated by a number of different doctors, and you could get a sense of different dispositions to the modern scientific way of viewing things depending on how old the doctor was. So I had one young doctor who would put the needles in, treat me with the needles, but then put tiny little electrical cables on the needles and run very minor pulses through the needles and through the muscles, which is kind of a recognized form of relaxation for muscles, a way of dealing with pain, that kind of stuff. Whereas the older doctors, and this I really enjoyed this, they would have me seated. Generally speaking, they'd put in a lot more needles, so I'd get a lot more in the skull, as well as the regions that we were directly treating. And then they had these little balls of incense that they would put on the end of the needles and set fire to them. And I would be sitting in this kind of modern-looking clinic, could be a doctor's office, behind a curtain with very poor ventilation. And I'm stuck through with needles like something from a horror movie. And these needles have balls of fire with incense that feels almost like I'm in some kind of Buddhist temple. And although I had this revelation for a moment that this is probably what it was like to receive treatment in ancient Egypt, where there was no
Yeah.
distinction between the religious ritual and the act of healing. Like my whole body was going up in this kind of burning incense, and I just thought it was truly wonderful, like an absolutely crystal clear recognition that what we were doing wasn't just tinkering with a machine, that there was there's a lot more going on than just my biological functions that a modern scientist would see. And I think for the listener, it's important to remember that a simple dichotomy between uh, biological body and spirit is also a kind of handing down from the Cartesian dualism, even if it's not exactly Cartesian dualism in and of itself. Most people in most places at most times believed there was a huge spectrum between the very highest spirit and the very base or the very gross material body. And then between that, there were multiple layers, like almost layers in a cake, that became ever more spiritualized as it went up. And you could have problems in one of those planes of reality that is trickling down to your biological physiology. And to you could only ever treat the symptoms in your physiology. But if you wanted to get to the root of the cause, you'd have to go, you'd have to find a way of treating the subtler parts of your anatomy, the occult organs. And this is what makes sense of something like Hildegard of Bingen recommending crystals for the use of treatment, or even treatment that happens in dreams, where you are much more in your subtle body than you are in your everyday sort of material awareness. These places can have their own landscape of physiology that requires treatment.
It's
And as
interesting as well that we've had to kind of reinvent this in recent times through this medical category called mental health. So, we've had to reinvent this idea that actually there could be something manifesting in your tangible physical body that's all chaotic and a mess, but actually this may be because there's something else going on, and depending on which doctor you talk to, it might require some kind of chemical drug, or it might require therapy or whatever, but there's something going on that simply can't be accounted for by reference to either your your heart health, or your lymphatic system, or your respiratory system, or nervous system, or whatever it is. There's something else going on, and so we've had to invent this massive ambiguous category called mental health, which is almost like trying to shoehorn hylomorphism in through the back door into a kind of otherwise completely materialist, reductionist account of the human person. It's kind
and
of, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad.
absolutely, and there's also a recognition of just how broad this category of mental health is, because it is given causal responsibility over many physical ailments.
Mm,
Like the
mm.
mind is able to cause patches of red skin to emerge, to rashes can emerge. People can, through simply the act of what is explained as mental belief, people can lose the ability to use their limbs through the process of hypnosis, for example. Like this is an incredibly powerful category, but it's sort of trivialized as a in a by being psychologized. But I suppose another area where this kind of seeps through is in placebos. So people given things that mechanistically are known to have no healing effects, and yet can have extraordinary healing effects, to the point where there's a massive crisis in medicine, because so many supposedly effective treatments don't actually show a massive improvement over placebo. And strangely, placebo effects fluctuate in different countries. Placebos work in different ways. Different types of treatment have different placebos. But the placebo is so powerful, it even works in the area of things like surgery, where there have been studies that showed um, two groups of people having knee surgery, and one of them having sort of the external cutting open of the skin, but no actual surgery on the knee, and the other group having both the cutting open and the surgery on the knee, and showing very little difference in the recovery rate between the two, as long as both groups believed they'd had knee surgery. Um,
Interesting.
and
Well, I mean,
and so
certainly there is quite a lot of statistical data being accumulated on how traditional ways of life tend to give rise to physical health. So, just at a very basic level, um, older people who have a relationship with their grandchildren, so are living intergenerationally, tend to be far less likely to get Alzheimer's. They tend to live much longer, up to 12 years more than those who don't have strong ties with their family. Um, Even much younger people who suffer from what they would identify as chronic loneliness, and that is a growing problem in particularly in the West at the moment, have far more physical health problems. Their immune systems don't work as well. They have poor skin. There are all sorts of problems. Now you might be able to give a purely physical explanation to this, that they're more likely to eat poor food, to not be as active, or all sorts of things. But actually, a lot of these people are the sort of people who are highly neurotic about such things. They think a huge amount about body fat percentage, and they watch a large number of YouTube videos about how to get fit and how much cardiovascular they should be doing in comparison to how much strength training and resistance training they should be. And they're often highly neurotic about exactly all of those things within the purely materialist category of what it is to be healthy. But simultaneously, they're modern in every other sense. They're cut off from their family. They don't have integrated friendship groups. They don't know their neighbor. They're not localist in that way. Their life is online, etc., etc., and they just end up being thoroughly unhealthy as a consequence. So yes, go ahead.
interesting to think that traditionally, I mean, even in modern philosophy, I believe that this is recognized, that identity is relational. Um,
Sure,
so if
sure.
a person has a an absence of relationality, and which should be there, there is actually kind of a diminution in the self's
Yes, of course.
reality, and
Yes,
that
I mean the self actually is a relation that exists between rational agents.
So if that was true on a metaphysical level, not just in semantics, you would expect the person who's suffering from loneliness to experience all sorts of physical ailments because they're withdrawing from reality as goodness. They're
Yes, and
they're
becoming
slipping
less a
into,
person
yeah.
as a consequence. Yeah.
So it's totally indicative of a more traditional metaphysics. Um, and so I
It-
think that this gives kind of at least a degree of explanatory power to the placebo effect. The expectation of healing and the intention of healing on behalf of the healer, in and of itself, already has a certain causal power because it's relational. Like it's this
yeah.
benign relationality.
I think it's quite exciting that some of this stuff seems to be making its way back. There's a growing interest in mushroom therapy, for example. And I don't just mean the use of psychoactive mushrooms, although I do know of cases where that seems to have been of enormous benefit to people. Um, but also just the properties that lots of mushrooms have, um, that are enormously beneficial. And again, to just be a little bit anecdotal for a moment, um, back in 2020, when the COVID bug was going around, when I got hit by it, um, it was quite interesting. I mean, it was clearly a bioweapon. Whether it escaped deliberately or not is another question, but it was clearly a bioweapon because it didn't feel to me or to anyone else anything like an illness, that I mean, I've had swine flu. I've had various tropical illnesses in India. I've had the annual flu. I know what a normal bug feels like, right? That humans and other animals have to contend with. This didn't. It seemed to bypass every ability of the body to engage with it normally. It was almost like it started in the bones and made its way outwards, rather than beginning with a cold and a sore throat and then the energy loss and then the achy joints and everything else that we're used to. It was like it was much closer to descriptions that I've read in Renaissance manuscripts of what it's like to be poisoned. Um, by a jealous courtier or whatever, right? And I was extremely unwell with this COVID, and it lasted for about 10 or 12 days, I think. And then when it finally I started to recover, what really surprised me was that it seemed to linger in my mind, and I fell into a terrible depression. Um, and I remember going out to the woods with my dog for a hike, and it was to a woodland of which I'm particularly fond, and I often go there to pray the Rosary or the Jesus Prayer, or to just sit with my Creator, in this woodland. And I went there, and I was walking the dog, and I was looking around, and it was like all color and life had been drained from the world. It was like the world had been completely flattened. And it was almost as if I was seeing the world for the first time, as if God did not exist, right, at all. And then I remember calling up my wife on my mobile phone and saying, it, it's like God doesn't exist. Everything is grey, and I don't know how to get out of this. And I remember sort of, I mean, it sounds a bit dramatic, but I remember falling prostrate on the floor, on the bed of the woodland, and crying out to God to return to the world because I couldn't see Him anymore. It was like everything. It was. I was seeing the world as the worst possible nihilist could have seen the world, and and it was my sister, who said to me when I chatted to her later, said, "You need to get hold of some lion's mane mushrooms, and you need to take a lot of it." And now lion's mane mushrooms have been used in China for about 4,000 years to treat melancholia, what we call feeling sad or being depressed. And feeling sad can get very serious, as we're discovering more and more in the modern world. And it's always been a problem because it's woven into the nature of the fall, that our intellects become darkened in very severe ways at various times in our lives. But lion's mane mushrooms has been one of the ways by which ancient civilizations have dealt with this. So I ordered a big tub of dried lion's mane, and I consumed quite a lot of it. And within 24 hours, this entire dark cloud had lifted, and it just had the most extraordinary transformative effect.
Fascinating.
On my mind. Yeah, so there's we're going to have to recover all of this stuff, and
It
yeah,
seems to me that that plays right into a truly ancient conception of the microcosm and the macrocosm. That
yeah,
our who we are is a reflection of the vast cosmic order, and problems within, to use slightly sort of inside outside language, um, can be remedied by bringing in things from the outside which are just proper reflections of what should be on the inside. If we remember that all mushrooms and everything the cosmos gives out has spiritual qualities, if you are suffering from a kind of spiritual malady, which all illness in some ways is, then
mm-hmm.
that can be, that certain restitutions can be made by bringing in the spiritual qualities from the extension of ourselves that is the fullness of the cosmic order.
Yeah, and I think if one just bears in mind that within your body there are more alien, to use that word very loosely, alien fungal cells than there are human cells, and that no human cell in your body can function properly without it being in some way coextensive with an entire mycelial ecological complexus on which you're dependent on all the time. And increasingly we're starting to realize that most of what we mean by health is in some way linked to gut health, which is where this entire fungal system is predominantly concentrated. I mean, it shouldn't surprise us then that so many of the antidotes that we will find in the world are with the fungal networks that cover the entire landscape out there. And yes, exactly, we are contiguous with the world. That's the main point here.
And if I remember correctly, I think it was Galen, but it was probably a number of the ancient physicians who emphasized that what we ate was fundamental to our health. And we're really discovering this in the modern world, where for the very first time, we are a wealthy, prosperous society that's eating food which is somewhere between poison and totally nutritionally deficient.
Yeah,
And
so
even rich
we're
people.
all basically fat and starving now.
Exactly. This isn't a rich and a poor thing. If you're a really rich person living in the center of London, trying to find a good quality mushroom that actually grew in the ground is going to be close to impossible. Everything you see in the shop is going to be filled with hormones or pesticides, or was grown in a weird, unnatural way. The breads you have are so processed that it initiates responses in your body, which cause irritation, inflammation. Everything that we're ingesting is slowly degrading our health and entire societies. So no, in some ways, it's, I think, contributing to the hysterical madness it must be if millions of people all living together are all eating poison. What would you expect other than hysterical waves of insane behavior?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, this is what actually, funnily enough, teaches us that we are so coextensive with the world as to be largely one thing with it. That when we mistreat it, when we mistreat the world, which after all is our only home and has been made by God to give glory to Him, and when we trespass in that way, we end up being the ones who get poisoned. It comes back to bite us. I think it might be quite interesting to talk about vaccinations as as forms of medical practice that I think are in large part quite dependent on the mechanistic metaphor concerning the body. One of the things that's really interested me for a long time, perhaps before we get onto that, is specifically the role that vaccination plays in the liberal conception of society. So, I mean, the liberal conception of society is essentially, in a nutshell, and this is whether you're looking at continental liberalism or you're looking at the more the forms of liberalism that might be more better known to us in the Anglosphere. And I suppose this finds its kind of its summit, I suppose, in Rawls, in John Rawls' theory of society, where, in any case, essentially, to put it very crudely, the individual must discover not so much the good of his nature or the common good of society, but he must discover his own preference of how he wants to live as a self-authoring being, not in relation to others, but precisely as a truth unto himself. And he has to make a contractual agreement with the state, which is that the state will allow him to do that. The state will allow him to self-author into what he wants to be. And it will predominantly allow him to do that by protecting him on his journey of self-authorship. So the state, rather than deploying laws in order to order the citizenry towards their good and their flourishing, which the state can't identify because that's up to each individual, the role of the state rather is to deploy laws and to enforce those laws to protect the space necessary for each individual to discover himself. Okay. Now, obviously, there are a whole load of assumptions about what the self is and what the individual is and what self-authorship is that I simply would reject outright. But nonetheless, that's the position of the kind of liberal conception of what the individual is and how he relates to the political machine. Now, the question has always been in the minds of liberals, by what mechanism or by what framework do you judge whether the state is really doing that competently? And for the liberal, besides just simply, stamping down on knife crime or, burglary or anything like that, the primary way by which the state can do that is it can prevent you from getting sick. And the reason why this is so important is because getting sick or getting ill is going to be the main way by which people are going to be prevented from self-realizing. And so it becomes very important within liberal political theory later on to determine how exactly the state is going to operate an entirely state-funded healthcare system, which really was totally on the periphery of of political theory up until liberalism, right? Um, Being a physician, being one of the cunning folk, as they were called in medieval times, being a doctor, was very much considered to be one of the social roles that someone can have. The idea that it was meant to be an organ of the state itself, and one of the ways by which the state fulfills its obligations to its citizenry, was kind of unthought of. So the whole notion of the state being the driver of a massive healthcare based polity is a completely liberal idea. Now, the ultimate way by which the state can do this in the liberal's mind is by somehow kind of placing in the machine, in the computer, a chip, or if you like, by downloading the necessary software to stop the hardware from ever getting a virus in the first place, right? And that's what the vaccine is. And I don't want to get into a conversation about whether we should be pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination. I'm just simply saying that it's important to understand this, because when people have even tentative, not even objections, but concerns or questions about vaccination, and they voice those concerns to someone who is ideologically progressive, what that person will generally find, and often be quite surprised by, is this incredibly visceral and vitriolic response, right? How dare you question vaccinations? You want everyone to die? Are you selfish? Do you want everyone to end up with a plague, and or are you just going to rely on the herd immunity of everyone else who has been vaccinated, and you're not, and you suddenly find yourself with this kind of barrage, right? And you, a lot of people who are just kind of slightly open-minded and want to explore different topics will often be quite surprised by this, and they'll say, well, hold on, I just think that, for example, the use of heavy metals like mercury as a stabilizer and a sanitizer within vaccine combinations might have detrimental effects, or maybe it won't. I'm asking the question, and suddenly you get all this kind of aggression thrown at you. Often people are so surprised by that because they don't understand the role that vaccination plays in a wider liberal philosophy. That if you like, it is the absolute key to understanding the perfect realization of the state as a healthcare-based polity. And so I just thought it might be helpful to
I
go
think
through
what
that.
you're saying is very interesting, and I wonder how much this must be deeply related to the movement of healing from the spiritual sphere as it used to be before I would say before the Reformation. The healing was something that was done at monasteries. It would involve priests, or
Mm-hmm.
if it involved cunning folk, it was part of the spiritual life of
Sure.
the location. It wasn't under the direction of the temporal sword. The king didn't manage healing in his. He managed crime and the peace and all these other things. It wasn't his business to manage healing. It was always either directly or indirectly under the auspices of the church.
I mean, even then, he didn't even really manage crime.
Right.
You have to remember that England didn't even have a police force until Robert Peel, right? It had local militias, but even that was a late thing. I mean, if you had a criminal in your village, it was the job of everyone down the pub to go and find him and beat the living daylights out of him. It was this. I mean, we have to understand how, for our ancestors, how distant the modern concept of the state really was.
It's completely consumed all of these different areas of life that were organic, to some degree more or less related to the spiritual life, and it's brought them in and created departments of its temporal power. And I think so something like the NHS on the one hand is kind of necessary when you destroy all the monasteries, places of healing, and you ridicule the shrines and the holy wells, which were the objects of pilgrimages for people who were looking for healing. Eventually, you've gutted all of the spiritual practices and all of the perennial healing practices. You have to replace it with something, and then the state congratulates itself with making it free at the point of use, or public, or however you want to describe it. And most people are stuck in this dichotomy. Should healthcare be private, or should healthcare be public? And completely missing the bigger point that healthcare should be part of the spiritual life of
Yeah.
the nation.
And the whole
Neither public nor private, those categories don't fit the spiritual life.
But the thing is that self-realization, according to the progressive, is his counterfeit for the spiritual life. So what you have in a healthcare-based polity within liberalism is just a counterfeit church. It's a counterfeit spirituality. So it's, recently this statistic came out that in the United Kingdom, currently the NHS removes 2 penises a day from men, right? There are 2 men every day. The taxpayer is paying to have his genitalia mutilated or removed altogether, and most of these are teenagers. Right, these are extremely vulnerable young men, and when you kind of zone out for a moment, and you stand there and you kind of go, under what definition do they mean that this is healthcare? Right, taking a healthy organ of the body and removing it and tossing it in the bin, right, is the absolute antithesis of healthcare, right? So what do they mean by healthcare? Hold on a minute. What they mean is that they saw this particular mutilation to be absolutely bound up with this particular individual's journey of self-authorship. And therefore it is absolutely necessary for the state, whose job it is to create the necessary arena by which the citizenry can author themselves, to pay for this. Otherwise, the state simply isn't doing its job, according to the liberal progressivist conception. And this is really where and the trouble is, if you don't understand that, if you don't understand how a liberal regime exists and its particular conception of healthcare as integral to its entire mission, bound up to its counterfeit spirituality of self-discovery and self-authorship, then you just stand there mystified. You're like, what the hell has everyone gone mad? No, they haven't gone mad at all. They're being extremely consistent with their established premises. Okay,
But
they haven't
the
gone
interesting
mad.
thing is, it's also extremely consistent with the traditional metaphysical view of the self as relational, because when the self is then defined as being sort of self-authoring, which is basically saying unrelated to all the other
Yeah,
things, all these
a
relations,
world unto himself.
exactly, and all those other relations in some ways are barriers to true selfhood.
Yes.
Well, if the self as relational is true, then you would expect people who've separated themselves from relationality to start removing parts of themselves, because that's exactly what the diminution of a person would be. Like, as you slip away from the good, you become less a person. Well, you cut parts of your body off. That seems like an obvious way to diminish the person.
Yeah, not just that, but actually, what ends up happening is that any action that is inherently transgressive ends up being the preferred option for a liberal regime, because if, if, actually, it's your history, your customs, your mores, your beliefs, your your pieties, your patriotism, your religious affiliation, your family connections, all of these things that are not the things that make you, but the things from which you have to emancipate yourself so you can discover your true self, right? Then it's always going to be the kind of family making Christian patriotic person who's going to be the icon of everything that's wrong with the world. And it's always going to be the person with like the stretched earlobe and the tattooed face and the dick chopped off, and it's always going to be that guy who's going to be the icon of absolute self liberation and realization. So it's just whatever is more and more transgressive is what fulfills the liberal promise, and that's why you end up with the world we're in.
Transgression is ultimately simply seen as freeing yourself from the bonds of superstition, of all of these irrational previous things that are holding human beings back from the utopian world which is just around the corner.
Yeah. And so if you don't believe any of that, if you don't believe the liberal case for how to build a civilization, which the listeners might have gathered you and I do not believe in it, then there's actually an obligation on you to reinduct yourself back into ancestral wisdom. And when you start doing that, that is going to have implications for how you understand the flourishing of the body and how you understand healthcare. And so, you start thinking seriously about elderberries and mushrooms, and you start reading Hildegard von Bingen or Marsilio Ficino's The Book of Life, which is all about how you cannot function as a rational, intellectual, spiritual being unless you are thinking about the flourishing of the body and your nutrition and all sorts of things. But he goes much deeper, of course, because he thinks that we're coextensive with the rest of the universe. He's also talking about the alignment of the planets. He's talking about where the Earth is in relation to the sun, or whether the moon is full or half. Or he's got an entire cosmic healthcare system, which he goes through in that very, very rich text. And then, of course, you've got the text that you've introduced me to, like Paul Sadir's Occult Botany and all of the kind of hermetic herbalist stuff, which whilst most of it was written, most of the available stuff today was written in the 20th century or the late 19th century, they're very much standing on the shoulders of giants like Albert the Great and Hildegard von Bingen and Ficino and all of these people who were just steeped in a cosmic view of healthcare.
It's worth pointing out that so much of what we now call Hermeticism, which has repeatedly sort of triggered the heckles of traditional Catholics, is just a category of thinking which would have been considered just part of the normal landscape of thinking to someone in the medieval world. They wouldn't have thought, oh, such and such is referring to a Hermetic idea. Yes, there may have been a Hermetic school of thought, but the idea that the stars might influence our health or should be taken into account in healthcare, or that crystals are useful for the healing journey. Any of these ideas would have, I mean, maybe people will have been more or less accepting of the idea, but it wouldn't have been categorized as some weird occult school of thought. It would have just been part of the normal discourse. The only real concerns anyone ever had was not to take away ultimate causality from God and not to live in a fatalistic universe.
Well, indeed. I mean, because they believed in secondary causation, that it was part of the dignity of creation, that God endowed it with its own causal structure, right? And that even secondary causation within creation is there to give greater glory to God. They took these things very, very seriously. And, book 4, as you know, of Hildegard's Physica is all on the use of crystals and stones to heal people. Thomas Aquinas wrote about the use of stones and precious metals to heal people. Albert the Great talked about these things.
And in
These
Hildegard's case, she used theological reasoning in her introductions to explain
yes,
why it was not only licit, but why it worked theologically as a sacred action.
yes, because she says that in that that Satan, as Lucifer, as the light-bearing senior angel, um, was adorned with on his spiritual body. She says his spiritual body was adorned with precious stones and crystals and gems, and that when he betrayed himself and betrayed God and denied his own finality, which was to adore God as gift in the beatific vision, and he plummeted into the abyss, he lost his former glory as light bringer. And so these beautiful stones and the way that, if you like, God has gilded the world with diamonds and gems and precious metals and all of these things, which the church has always recognized give glory to God, which is why the church wants to cover her chalices and her churches in these things. Um, uh, what Hildegard says is that when Satan is near, or he sees, or he is present to these precious stones and precious gems and so on, they remind him of his former glory, and they affect the opposite of what he wants to affect, which is the corruption of our human nature. They bring our human nature to a status of flourishing. So she's got a wonderful, wonderful description of all of this within a kind of not within a soteriological context.
You only have to open the book of Revelation to see that not only the New Jerusalem, but the entire throne room of the Godhead is described almost entirely in terms of crystals and various
Yes,
different
exactly.
colors of crystals. There's just nothing more than John can come up with, nothing more glorious in trying to explain it to all of us who've not been there than to use the thing that is closest in our material world, these crystals. And so it's important because we labored this point a little bit because it's not unusual to find well-meaning traditional priests go on long polemics against sort of the new age demonic practices of crystal healing. You wouldn't have to go very far on YouTube before you found somebody who would do that, and often priests who are quite respected. But you have to put it in context that in the medieval period, what they were saying would have just been considered so completely incomprehensible that
Oh, a lot of what we call New Age today is just old-fashioned Christianity that the church in her common culture alienated herself from under the influence of rationalism in the Enlightenment, and also because the church, unfortunately, in the 16th century, in trying to combat Protestantism, conceded a lot more territory to the Protestant worldview than I think a lot of us realize. And the Protestant view of the world is that it is dead matter, right? That's the Protestant view of the world. It's just stuff. It's not the primordial revelation of God. It can't tell us anything about the Creator. It's just stuff.
it's
The
arbitrary.
only
It could be
It's completely arbitrary.
it could be in any arrangement. God just
Yeah,
decided it was this way, but it could have been in any arrangement, and that would have it's just pure will on God's behalf. It's not
exactly,
logos.
exactly. Yeah, and in fact, going back to the old kind of Occamist metaphysics that the reformers rode upon quite a lot. If it's not arbitrary, then it's a limitation on God's creative act, and therefore you are limiting the omnipotence of God, and so it has to be arbitrary. It can tell you nothing about God, which is why God gives us Holy Scripture. God gives us Holy Scripture, so we can know something about him, which we wouldn't be able to know. We simply would never be able to know anything about him otherwise. Well, that's actually not the view of Scripture. The Scripture itself says, no, no, no. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. The Scriptures themselves point to the world as iconographic of the Creator. And that was the medieval view. The medieval view was that there are two books of divine revelation. There's the book of nature and the book of Holy Writ, and you need both. And that and it's quite
And it was the
it's
view
quite.
of sorry.
No,
Oh,
please,
sorry.
please. No, no,
I was
no.
just
Go
going to say it
ahead.
was a view of someone like Bonaventure, that these two books were fundamentally, in some very mysterious way, the same, because in some they were a reflection of a higher book, the Book of Life. And because the only reason why we needed the written scriptures is because the fall darkened our eyes to being able to read creation.
Yeah.
And so it was as a result of
Well, it
our
didn't just
blindness.
darken our eyes; it also darkened creation.
Right.
It also the fall also darkened the creation's ability to convey God, as it ought, right? Which makes you think that before the fall, imagine the glory of the cosmos, right? And and so the created order gets darkened, and actually the whole process of grace invading the world is to cause creation to reflect the creator again. So when you arrive at Chartres Cathedral, or you arrive at Wells Cathedral, or whatever, Notre Dame or Salisbury or whatever, and you see what the medievals did with local stone, right, with the created things available to them. So the created order in that little place or this little place, captured from the principality of Satan, placed under the kingdom of Christ, can now do to offer glory to God. And you see this kind of incredible structure erupting out of the ground and reaching up to the creator. And then you see these dark windows, and you step inside, and the created light passing through them causes this incredible technicolor majesty through the stained glass. And then you have all of the statues and the icons and the carved capitals on the pillars and everything, and all of this is just made out of the created stuff of the world. What you are actually seeing is the concretization of the operation of grace in the world, right? And so this is, and of course, when you get the retreat of grace from the world, or the retreat of man from grace in the world, you get modern churches, and you get the kind of crap that we make today.
So I always, this is where things maybe get a little bit weird, but that's my favorite thing. That there has been a tradition for a long time that in some of the great European cathedrals, some of the stained glass from the 13th century was made by alchemists, and that there's a
That's right.
quality to them which goes far beyond just aesthetic beauty, and that there's in a very real sense, a concretization of grace in the glass itself, which if you stand under and the sun's light goes through these alchemical windows, there is a spiritual transformation that takes place in anyone who's there, especially in a state of grace. That these windows haven't really been replicated since. There seems to have been like this 70 to 100 year glorious moment where the alchemists worked alongside the cathedral builders and produced this spiritualized glass. And ever since then, we've been trying to chase building or making glass the same with the same degree of beauty and spiritual luminosity, and nobody has been able to replicate it. I think
There, there,
at
there are
Chartres,
certain there are certain windows from that period that you're talking about where when light passes through them, they emit a color on the other side into the cathedral, and no one has been able to work out, even by taking chips from the glass and testing them, no one's been able to work out how the light changes color in that way, because there doesn't seem to be anything in the glass that causes it to do that. There's something going on that actually our kind of laboratories can't identify there. to go back to sacred healing, I just wanted to pick up on something, if you don't mind, Brian,
Sure.
that was said earlier that I think is open to misunderstanding. One of one of the problems with let me put it this way: today we still do see that spiritual intervention can have something to do with healing. And it's almost like the modern way is still stuck in this two-tier vision, where it's like, well, we've given him a course of antibiotics, we've tried this therapy and that therapy, radiotherapy, whatever it is. We've tried zapping it with a laser, we've tried doing it, and you kind of go through everything that's on offer that modern medicine and then it's like, so having done all that and none of its work, let's pray over him, right? And then you pray over him and then the healing takes place. You go, oh, okay, great, right? But then what you're basically saying is there are two things here. There's medicine, then there's the hope for a miracle, okay? And I'm not saying that that doesn't work on occasion, but what it is it's to see the spiritual activity and the spiritual interaction with this particular ailing person and medical treatment as two completely separate things. And if one doesn't work, let's try the other, rather than what the historically, as you said, healing was in the spiritual repertoire of the Occidental man, and not just the Occidental man, but universally. But we've lost it in the Occident. So it would be perfectly normal to treat somebody's ailment with a herb or a medicine or whatever it is, and to pray with that person and to call on the guardian angel of that person and to ask the saints who are particularly connected with healing, like my patron, Saint Sebastian, who's one of the most important patrons of unwell people, of sick people, of diseased people, to come and to look after this person. And that actually the sacrality of the things of the world into which God's benignity has been woven to bring people to healing as coextensive with the world, and the spirituality of the world as a created order pregnant with the operation of saints and angels and the presence of God and the intervention of the Magna Mater of Our Lady. It's all one thing. It's all one thing going on at the same time. And it seems to me that that is a vision of the world that we desperately need to recapture. And when people say that the modern world is crying out for re-enchantment, they probably mean something like that.
This is what it's meant by the phrase priesthood of all believers, because every man and woman stands at the halfway point between heaven and earth and is in some way the filter between the two. And Christ, all of Christ's different ministries, in some sense, before the eschaton, are healing ministries, whether it's literally the healing of a physical ailment or the healing of the spiritual ailment. It's all restoration of the original goodness, and all baptized believers are being brought into that. The priesthood, the priesthood who dispense the sacraments have a very specific, narrow calling in the sense of bringing the Eucharist and those other means of grace. But the priesthood of all believers doesn't mean that minus the sacraments. What it does mean is exactly what you've just described, in that sense, to be this mediating element between the unfortunately, due to the fall, separated heaven and earth, but which we are acting to repair with. And that is exactly when on Judgment Day we stand before our Maker and we're called to give account. And the list of things that Christ lists: did you visit me in prison? Did you feed me? And so all of those things are exactly that: the healing of the world, the healing of the nations, the healing of your neighbor, or this healing priestly action, in which we are standing in this is the mystery the angels marvel at. How is it that we little human beings are being given the task of standing against the corrosion and corruption of nothingness, which is the destiny of this world, because it's turned its face away from God, but God has not abandoned, yet chooses the tiny insignificant human being to be his agent, to bind back together, in wisdom, the form and the matter, the heaven and the earth.
Hmm. And I think it's just worth remembering that when God walked among us, personally present, um, during his ministry, um, Jesus Christ walked among us as a healer. That and he always presented bodily ailments as intrinsically bound up with the spiritual life, connected to faith, connected to sin, connected to evil, all of these things. And there are moments, when, like with the centurion, when he just heals from a distance, as it were, from a geographical distance. But there are other moments where he uses the things of the world, where he takes his own saliva and he makes a clay with the dirt of the earth in order to heal people. And we should take all of these things, like every moment that's recorded in the life of our Lord, and indeed that's not recorded in Holy Writ, um, as didactic, as telling us something about what it means to be another Christ in the world. Um, it might be helpful for our listeners just to recommend a couple of titles if they're interested in the topic of sacred healing.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, I mean, for my part, occult botany that you recommended to me, which I've greatly enjoyed studying, by Paul Sadir. There's a very nice edition that you can find online of Hildegard von Bingen's Physica. There's also a commentary by two authors called Strello and Hertzka. Um, a commentary on Hildegard's medicine called Hildegard's Medicine. There's also the piece that there's the work by, I don't know how to say his name, Marverick, called Hermetic Herbalism, which is an interesting text. There's the Book of Secrets of uh, Albert the Great, which has recently been published again in English, in a fine English translation. And of course, what we've already mentioned, Ficino's book, or rather, it's three books, the three books of life, um, which you can find in a very fine translation from 1880s, online. Those are the ones that immediately come to mind that are kind of from the tradition.
I would add Paul Sadir's other work, The Healings of Christ. That would
Mm.
be an excellent addition. I have a really unusual book that's hard to get hold of, but is one of my most precious books. It's called The Green Mysteries, and it is a text filled with the most beautiful woodblock carvings, and is filled with the occult and esoteric qualities of many of the plants and flower species that we would be familiar of in the west of Europe and in North America. Really special work I've got lots of sort of books on these sort of weird botanical subjects. The Witch's Cabinet is another one. There's a whole chapter in there on the Marian the Marian plants.
Mm.
There's a really rich vein of books that are not
Yeah,
very well
and
known.
there are quite a lot of, I mean, just looking on Amazon, there are quite a lot of popular books on herbalism that are pretty good, actually. I mean, my wife, who's fascinated by herbalism, has most of these books, and they're I mean they're worth looking at. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, I read a couple of years ago. I read Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, Rupert Sheldrake's son.
Right.
I mean, I've returned to it several times since I read it to read other sections of it again. I think it's a superb book, and the growing interest for some reason or another. The growing interest in mushrooms as a separate kingdom from the animal and plant kingdom that have a whole a whole kind of landscape of mysteries of their own that we barely understand at all. I think that's a very good thing, and he does a marvelous job of bringing out why we should be excited by this growing interest and why it's so important. But he talks quite a lot about the healing properties of fungi in that book. So that is a book that I would highly recommend to people. I think that one of the reasons why there's a growing interest at the moment in fungi as a kingdom of their own, um, is that so Lord Northbourne in this book of the Land and Spirit, he talks about how the well, he makes a distinction. He makes a distinction between what he calls a symbiotic relationship with the landscape and a predatory relationship with the landscape. And he says the whole of late modernity is, in terms of its ecology and its farming, is characterized by predatory agriculture and predatory farming and predatory livestock rearing, that we are not operating symbiotically as every other creature tries to do, right? And that's what, because otherwise, if creatures don't have it built into them to live symbiotically with their surroundings, they destroy their own habitats. So creatures naturally do this, and humans, largely because of sin, I expect, always fall into this hyper predatory relationship with the rest of the world, and it's meant to be the operation of grace that causes us to overcome that, which when we are proper recipients of it, you get the kind of husbandry that you can observe being discussed about, for example, the Cistercians of Northern Europe in the 13th century, and so and H.J.
The
Massingham.
recipient of grace is to become an agent of grace in the world.
Yes, exactly. You become another Christ. You become a locus of the divine presence in the created order again. H.J. Massingham talks a lot about Cistercian husbandry in the Cross of Life. The Tree of Life, his book on agriculture and so on, that's recently been republished by Angelico Press. That's a great text. One of the consequences of our predatory relationship with the landscape, to use the terminology of Northbourne, is that we have destroyed the mycelial subterranean webs on which all of our trees and our grasses and our wildflowers and everything depend. Which has been a kind of complete disaster. So there's this neglected kingdom called the fungi, the fungal kingdom, the mycelial kingdom, the mushroom kingdom, which we've completely neglected it, and as a consequence, we've wrecked it with fungicides and pesticides, and now everything is dying. So and this is actually a pathway into thinking symbiotically again, which is really what we should have been doing all along. And so perhaps this growing interest in the fungal kingdom is a very, very good thing indeed.
One last book that stands out from my shelves is called Grand Marvelous Secrets by the Abbé Julio, who's a 19th century French bishop. And he's collected together all sorts of prayer practices that are used for specific healing of specific maladies. So there's an entire index at the back of the book in which you choose an illness, a sickness, from really quite serious stuff to more mundane illnesses, and he has combinations of different psalms and different types of holy water and different practices to combine all together specifically for any ailment. And I believe this collection, he worked hand in hand with a French healing mystic, and so this is a very interesting part of the Catholic tradition that's not very well known.